Greetings and salutations. It is I, Mr. Nothing, the museum curator of the weird and the strange and the host, who might be a swamp monster. Welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual literature, out of the ordinary literature that I found in my travels through the swamps of Georgia. Today I wanted to talk about a book that I read. A book that came out in 2015 that is about various swamp monsters, killer plants, and unaccompanied teenagers, unaccompanied minors through the swampland. I am talking about The Murk by Robert Lettrick. Yep. An interesting cover. It features a swamp with a creature coming out of the swamp. What is that creature? You got to know more about it from the cover. It's very interesting. And I thought it would be interesting when I read it, but it turns out this book is kind of a stinker, based on, very underdeveloped characters and a story that doesn't really get interesting until the final 50 pages, and just a lot of weird decisions on the part of the author. It comes off as bad, and so for me it's not a problem because I probably wouldn't have read this if it wasn't for this channel. But this is being stocked in libraries and public schools all over the country, and children are being exposed to really kind of poor middle grade literature, which is, that's kind of extreme to say, but, I have my reasons, which I will lay out later. The only reason I really picked this up is because I wanted to explore, young adult fiction for Ocpoeber, because I've been checking out, Edgar Allan Poe and Batman and spooky stories and whatnot, but I haven't really taken the time to explore what they're offering to the youths of the world, and that is why I decided to check this out. I got it from my local library. Don't forget to patronize your local libraries because, it's always a great time and you never know what they have, including stuff like this. I thought I would talk about this, a little summary, a little analysis, and we will move on from there. Well, first and foremost, before we start, I should point out this is Robert Lettrick's second book. He may have other material, but as far as I could find, he only has this book and another book called The Frenzy, which is also middle grade horror, that seemingly is connected to this book through the prologue. So, that's interesting. This book The Murk starts off with the prologue in the story. The Piper Canfield and her family are on vacation in Washington. Her family stops off at a camp zone where they're the only ones there, and they are their parents go on a hike. Piper receives a phone call from her friend Tad, who informs her that some domestic terrorist dude released a rabies disease, mutated form of it into the air around Washington, and so that's turning all the animals into wild beast monsters that want to eat any human they see. Around this time, Piper notices that her baby sister, who is outside of the RV, is being approached by a wolverine, and so Piper races to rescue her sister. The prologue stops abruptly there, but we later find out that she manages to rescue her sister no problem. The prologue kind of feels weird and out of place, and if it establishes that Piper cares about her family and will do anything to protect them, the main story does that already. So the prologue feels unnecessary and only exists to somehow connect it to Frenzy, Lettrick's previous story, and so it's kind of weird in that regard. But the main story starts a little while later. Piper and Tad have grown apart because Piper somehow blames Tad for what happened in Washington, despite the fact that it doesn't really make any sense for her to blame him. It's very confusing. Anyways, Piper learns that her little sister Grace has Alper's disease. There's no real cure for it. The only thing that the doctors can do is treat the pain, and eventually Grace will die. Piper really loves her family to the point where she like made a wish once upon a time for a baby sister and like promised that she would absolutely take care of that little sister regardless of anything else going on in her life. And 10 months later, Grace was born, so she's dedicated to taking care of Grace. Anyways, she tells all this to Tad, and Tad just like he says that there's no real cure for Alpers as well. However, there might be a plant-based herb, because he's a botanist, there might be a plant-based cure that could help with Alpers disease in some way. And he refers to the notes from his ancestor, Brisbane Cole, who pops up throughout the story, because you read journals of his notes through the swamp in the story as well. So they read his notes, and they discover that he was going to a specific swamp, let's call it Ocpoeber Swamp in Georgia, to look for a cure for his ailing wife at the time. And so they decide, hey, let's go down to that swamp. Maybe we can find the plant and get the cure and help my baby sister. Despite the fact that they're, they're teenagers and they shouldn't be going into dangerous swamps, they go down there. They meet two of the locals, Perch and Macy, who agree to escort them through the swamp and give them a ride in their boat, the Mudcat. They wander their way through the swamp. Dangerous animals attack them, and eventually they discover that the animals are following them through the swamp for some unknown reason. And when they get to the giant plant at the sort of like center of the swamp, they discover that the plant is connected to the animals in some way, and that it's releasing a chemical that's causing the animals to get agitated and attack whenever they try to cut off the flowers of the plant. So it's a protection kind of system. Piper's brother, Creeper, who likes to climb up trees, joined them on the journey, and he climbs up to the top of the plant to get a flower. And when he begins cutting, the plant goes wild, and like some of its tentacles coming out of the water, and it begins to attack. And unfortunately, in the chaos, Macy dies, and Perch is upset about this, but the kids convince him to continue on so that they can finish what they set out to do. But they also decide that they have to leave the swamp because it's a little dangerous at this point, which makes a lot of sense. So they get set to head out, but Piper's like, we got to go back to the boat. The cure is on the boat, and if we don't get the cure, then this was all for nothing. Along the way, Tad is stung by a nettle from the plant, and he begins to go blind. Creeper is attacked by the plant and taken underground, and Piper manages to save him. Eventually, they get to like a central cavern, Piper and Tad, where the main part of the plant is, and they discover that it pretty much extends all across the swamp, and it's an apex predator despite being a plant, which is interesting. Anyways, Piper eventually manages to blow up the plant through using some of its chemical compounds against it, and they manage to get the cure and then leave the swamp, and everything is a-okay with the story. And that's pretty much where it ends. Well, there's not a lot that's good with this story in terms of analysis. That one of the few good things is how Lettrick describes the swamp. It's a dangerous place, and multiple characters point out that how it seems to be alive. Like, something seems to be watching them in the swamp, something seems to be aware of their presence, stalking them at times, and everything in the swamp seems to want them dead. Which is never a good thing, But I really enjoy it because it creates an atmosphere of horror within this book. One of the few good things is that Lettrick manages to capture that atmosphere of like this horrifying swamp that host the deadliest creatures, and including a giant plant creature that wants you dead. And it gets increasingly worse because the animals are following the main characters at some point. And so you wonder, like, what's going on here? Are these characters going to make it out? What's the deal with this mystery swamp? There's a good point that I want to get at with this story. A good passage that I wanted to quote. Here goes. In their exuberance, they forgot something. Behind them, the creatures of the swamp funneled into the lagoon and spread out inside it like a disease. Gliding silently underwater, they began to close the gap that had until now separated them from the mudcat. So I like that. It's one of the really good parts of the story where he compares the creature's movements, Lettrick does, to a disease. And you know what disease brings? It brings death. So the creatures are closing in. They're going to try to kill these characters for an unknown reason. But we later find out it's because the plant is kind of controlling these reptiles, and so it's not looking good at this point. It does create a good sense of terror, and now, and I'm pretty sure high school Mr. Nothing would have enjoyed that section because it would have been pretty scary, and I do enjoy that there. But there are a lot of flaws with this book. The first one is that there's way too much exposition, and every story needs some exposition just to help you understand what's going on and who the characters are and the story of everything that's going on. And I feel like Lettrick could have done a better job with placing that exposition. Like, he could have put it mainly in the beginning or somewhere like in the middle and heavily focused it. I'm beginning to appreciate that Tolkien with The Lord of the Rings put a lot of the exposition in the very beginning, and sure, that made for a boring beginning, but it made the other parts like a lot more exciting because he wasn't busy telling us what was going on. We already kind of figured it out. So with this story, like, the problem is the exposition takes place in every single chapter. Like, the characters discover something and then they talk about it for a couple pages, and then they discover another thing and talk about it for a couple pages. And I feel like he could have spaced it out more because it really ruins the flow and the pacing of this book, and at times just makes it really, really, really boring. And as a result, it doesn't pick up until the final 50 pages, I would say, because by that point, there's no more exposition to give. And and at times the characters are giving exposition in weird places. Like, they're in the middle of the plant creature's lair, and they're just talking about it some more. And it's like, dudes, you're about to die. You need to get out of there. There's no time to talk about it. You gotta run. You gotta do something. You gotta do action. There's no more time for exposition. And I feel like that's a real weak point in this story. And then another thing that I just touched upon, but another flaw with the story, is the story and the characters are really boring. The story, for the most part, doesn't really kick into gear until like 200 pages in, when Macy gets in trouble, because none of the characters seem to be in any real danger throughout the story. The plant and the swamp creatures like attack, but you're never made to feel like that, like there's any sense of urgency in getting what they need and getting out. Especially with Grace, like, you think it'd be a race against the clock to rescue her baby sister, provide the cure to her baby sister, but Piper never really mentions that once after getting to the swamp. So the story lacks urgency, and and even when the like terrifying moments happen, some of the characters are still talking about things. It's like, there's no time to talk about this. That's weird. Just be quiet and run and focus on preserving your life. And then that relates to the characters too, because like the characters themselves aren't very interesting people. We don't know a lot about their identities. For instance, Creeper, Piper's brother in the story, his entire character development begins and ends with he likes to climb trees, and that's really all we ever learn about him through the story. And he's kind of upset that his sister doesn't pay as much attention to him anymore. But that's really all you get from Lettrick about Creeper. And Piper, like Piper has the potential to be a really fascinating character, because she cares about family to the point where she's willing to go to a swamp and rescue, or not rescue, but find the cure that'll eventually help her save her sister. But that's all he gives you about Piper. He doesn't really tell you any interesting details about her or show her motivation beyond family. And maybe all you need is family as a motivating factor. But I would like to know more about who Piper is as a person beyond other people. We get pretty close to that in the story as Tad and Piper talk about beauty pageants and Piper's friend, the Popular Girls, who she became friends with after the incident in Washington. But the issue with this is, like, again, Lettrick doesn't go far enough into giving you an understanding of who Piper is there. And he does the same thing with Tad, because Tad is kind of bland, and all you know about him really is that he's into herbology or plants or plant biology or whatever. And that's not enough to go off of. And he comes off as a know-it-all, arrogant kind of dude through this story. And at one point, like, Lettrick tries to get these two characters, Piper and Tad, to like be together, despite the fact that there's no real chemistry here, and like it seems kind of forced. It's not very good, and it feels like it only exists because that's what you're supposed to do in the young adult fiction genre is put two characters together. It just seems like he's checking boxes there at times. So I didn't like that either. Like the characters do get kind of interesting in the last 50 pages, but because we don't know a whole lot about them, it's like, why should I feel attached to these characters? If they were to die, like, that would be sad, I guess. I don't know. So ultimately, I would have to say I don't recommend this book for anybody. Not for me, not for adults, and certainly not for young adults, because I'm sure there's better young adult fiction horror out there that doesn't like suck, to be honest. The biggest problem with this is it doesn't care to try anything. It doesn't try to do anything cool. It doesn't want to be anything. It just wants to be a story with underdeveloped characters and a very somewhat interesting plot that really goes nowhere. The story seems to want to exist to be in libraries and to exist to be in schools, and that's fine and dandy, but no one's ever going to remember this story, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to forget it within like a week or two, which is pretty harsh, but I'd say that's more than what this book deserves. It's unnoteworthy is what I think I'm getting at there. Its biggest crime is that it does nothing at all. And so, I don't recommend it. Don't bother searching for this book, and maybe Robert Lettrick will get better as a writer. But I'm frankly tired of reading bad young adult fiction, because, we should give better to, we should have better offerings for young adults. We shouldn't just assume that they'll read anything, even though, to be honest, they probably will. If you have something to say about my review of this interesting and kind of terrible book, feel free to comment below. Or if you just want to talk about, random swamp creatures like Bigfoot or cryptids, comment below. And I would love to hear from you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that other people may find out about very subpar middle grade literature. I don't know why we want to tell them about it, but I guess we will. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and swampy travels. Farewell.